Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Open Gym. And for Volcano, the Open Gym session today is What's Your One Thing? And it's based on a book by Gary Keller, or The Concept of the One Thing. Came out 2 years ago in 2013. And its premise is based around one question, which I'll get to shortly. And just as a reminder, I guess the most useful thing about today's presentation for you is helping you become much more focused with how you spend your time. Reminders about your Volcano membership. So I would urge you to join at least one live session a week if at all possible. And that way you can ideally make a specific commitment to an action that is something that is a stretch for you, so that you can then hopefully report back on it the following week. It's certainly one of the benefits. Or make that commitment and then find somebody else that you can that's going to hold you accountable for that. And if that doesn't work as well as you'd like, then that would certainly be reason to consider the weekly membership groups, because that will give you that extra accountability and push. Well, I'm happy to do that if you're able to join in on the live sessions. So what's interesting about Gary Keller's book is that really it's almost all around one deceptively simple question that's not necessarily simple to answer. And the question is what's the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? And what I've learned in my own life is that that's not necessarily an easy question to answer. It varies from person to person. And certainly for myself, I'd have to say it's one of those questions where I thought I had a relatively clear answer, but the proof was in the pudding, and nothing happened to the pudding. And what I mean by that is one of the biggest takeaways in the book is as you think about this question, what's the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? It's tempting to think of something that may end up not being the right one thing for you. And so my goal today is to give you some examples and to talk about some of the other points that sort of surround and support this idea. But basically is, once you've identified your one thing, that you spend 4 hours a day, if at all possible, blocking out the time to do that one thing. As I said, I just think that in reality, you may need to think really hard about the one thing and frankly keep revisiting it regularly until you really do believe that you have hit the nail on the head. And I'm not going to pretend that it's straightforward. In fact, even in Gary Keller's book, he gives his own personal example where the board of his real estate firm brainstormed 100 things that the company could potentially do that would make the biggest difference. And then they narrowed it down to 20, and then they narrowed it down to 1. But clearly that took a long time. And the one thing they decided that would make the biggest difference for his real estate firm was that if he wrote a book, he as the founder of the firm wrote a book about how to make $1 million as a real estate agent. And luckily, that was a good decision. And Keller Williams went on to become the largest real estate company in the US. I don't honestly know if it still is, but it certainly was a major accomplishment with a firm that was very regional for a long time. For the author Stephen King, it's 4 hours of writing in the morning, as it is for many writers. They have a similar schedule up to their day, because that's when their brains are at their best. And so that's the thing to think about. Now, one of the most exciting things, I think, in the book is that this one thing is meant to be something. It's interesting. The way he writes about it, I suppose it's the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on your life. And for some people, he argues that one thing is going to be something that might be 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, because it's such a huge one thing that they want to aspire to, whether that might be some kind of financial freedom, or to be able to, get to a certain point in your life where you have complete freedom over how you choose all of your time. And then for other people, it's in theory, it's more of a shorter term piece. But in his opinion, it should be very big and very specific so that there's complete clarity over what it is. So, for example, one of the first people I introduced this book to, a client of mine, he realized that the thing that would have the biggest impact for him would be to build what he called a dream team to work with, such that then he could spend his time doing what he did best, which was building relationships with key people in his network and obviously bringing in new business. And so that gave him and his business partner great clarity on what positions they needed to fill and the type of people they needed that would help support them so that they could do what they do best. And that's what's interesting about the one thing is it's sometimes easy to confuse with the unique ability concept, in that which is more around what is it that you're best at, that what is it that you love to do and should be doing all the time. And certainly you can incorporate that into your one thing. But I'm not entirely sure they're necessarily the same thing. So, for example, I'll give you some other examples. Another client of mine was very clear that his one thing still is having 8 appointments a week with clients or prospects. And that if he maintains that kind of activity and consistency, that will then basically ensure that he meets his big goals, and that then obviously that knocks on over into his personal life as well. For another client of mine last year, interestingly, there was something for him about exercising, and I don't honestly remember how many times a week. It was at least 3, but I'm more inclined to think it was 5 or 6 times. But that he found that when he went swimming first thing in the morning, that had such a positive impact on the rest of the day for him. It put him in the right frame of mind, feeling great and emotionally great. And I think, I suspect, again, it had many benefits to him, that then the rest of his day went so much more effectively. And just yesterday, I was talking to a client of mine about his one thing, and he said that for him right now, it's really about getting his own house in order. And what he meant by that, the one thing was really, I think, in my language, I would say it's about feeling centered or at peace with himself in terms of his health, how much sleep he's getting, and also how much time he's spending with his wife and children. And that to him was the thing that he felt that he needed to get clear on in terms of how much time he needed for that, all those things, exercise, sleep, and time with loved ones, because that put him in a great position that the rest of his life would then follow accordingly. But when he put the work first and then crammed all that into his week and then tried to squeeze in little bits here and there with family and the occasional bit of exercise, it was constantly feeling frustrated and also not good physically. So again, these are just examples. I'll give you many examples actually of different people and what that is. And as I said, speaking personally, I've got to say this. I mean, I read the book and I thought, for some reason, I thought I was fairly clear about what my one thing was, but I didn't really know how to fit that into my week, into my diary, into my schedule. And so I didn't really do anything about it. And so, therefore, of course, I didn't get any results from it. And I can honestly say it's only because I've been talking about this book on and off every few months, and therefore revisiting it, that it really helped me gain clarity about what I need to spend my time on most. And I just found that really enlightening. So those are some of the suggestions. Now, let's just say your one thing is to have $1 million of turnover in your business, or £1 million of turnover in your business. That's your real one thing. And let's just say that that's something you can accomplish, you think, 3 years from now. And that's thinking big, by the way. That wasn't your original goal. Your original goal maybe was to get to 750,000 or 600,000. So you're really starting to get much more motivated about it. What I love, there's a really inspiring chapter in this book called "Big is Bad." Well, it's that's funny. It's in a section about dispelling myths, and let me find out what he calls that section. if I can. I know it's somewhere in here. The lies. It's in a section called The Lies. They mislead and derail us. And one of those things that he thinks is a lie is that big is necessarily bad. When in fact, on the contrary, he argues that thinking big is the way to live the most inspired life. And he tells a story about a presentation he once gave where someone challenged him and said, look, it's all very well for Stephen King to write for 4 hours a day, but isn't thinking big completely unrealistic? And I might as well just read what he said in the book. He said, I paused to reflect on this and then said, well, let me ask you a question first. Do you know what your limits are? No, was the reply. So I said that it seemed the question was irrelevant. No one knows their ultimate ceiling for achievement, so worrying about it is a waste of time. And he goes on to give examples of the person who created Hotmail, who was an immigrant to the United States and ended up selling it to Microsoft for $400 million. And when somebody talked about this man, his name was Sabir Bajia, I believe his name's pronounced, he said, well, what sets Sabir apart from the hundreds of entrepreneurs I've met is the gargantuan size of his dream. Even before he had a product, before he had any money behind him, he was completely convinced that he was going to build a major company that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And then he gives a great example. And this is the reason. There's several reasons why I'm sharing this. One is because typically we have our goals, and they're okay. They're 7 out of 10. And what's great about the thinking big piece is that, and the one thing focus, is that he argues that there becomes this domino effect, that it starts to just shift what you're capable of doing. So in other words, if your one thing is instead of 600,000 a year, it's 1 million 3 years from now, it shifts then what your 2-year goal is and what your 1-year goal is. And so incrementally, if incrementally this was going to be your reaching your 600,000 goal, incrementally when you start the million, bit by bit, you start to, because you're thinking bigger, you start to think differently about, well, if that's my one thing for 3 years, and this is my one thing for 2, and this is my one thing for a year, what does that mean then? So then you ask more, then you bring it back to the present and you say, okay, based on my one thing for this year, which might be create the dream team so I can get to 3 million, what's my one thing this month that's going to get me to the dream team or get me to my one thing for this year? And it gives that, it's a wonderful focusing question. One question that we do in the Golcano Weekly gyms that I love is this notion of what's my one thing this week? What's the most important thing this week that I need to focus on? And I just find that gives me fabulous focus in terms of stretching myself, because it's taking me again in a steeper learning curve versus what I might otherwise have just been doing if I'd just sort of been poddling along day to day, as I probably did a lot more in the past. And I just find that really inspiring. And as he says, think as big as you possibly can, and then base what you do and how you do it and who you do it with on succeeding at that level. And this has so many other applications. Who are you meeting with this week? Who are you meeting with next week? Are these people that can steer your business in that direction? Or is it the same old people, many of whom aren't actually referring you any business or recommending, or doing business with you or any of those things? And so it really does help us in so many different ways, I said. But the biggest benefit is focus. And then there are a few other tips in the agenda that I'm happy to share with you. Is because you're becoming more focused, it forces you to apply. In the book, he talks about the 80-20 rule. I mean, I think in many instances, it forces us to apply an even more focused approach, a 90-10 approach to who we spend time with, because in all likelihood, it is just a small number of people that are out there going to bat for us. And to pay increasingly more attention to a smaller number of people, which was borne out in another wonderful book, which I'll talk about, some of the lessons I learned from that book in a different session. I was just looking to see if I could grab it quickly. Yeah, this book, that came out also in 2013, Business Brilliant, an excellent book. And one of the chapters in there is around networking. And the book itself described the habits of what business owners and salespeople who made $1 million a year or more did differently than middle class business owners and salespeople. And one of the things that that book is all based on research that he found was that the millionaire had a core network of less than 6 people. And that really ties in very much to what Gary Keller talks about in terms of extreme focus. And I think where most people are afraid to do that, I think they think it's going to hurt too many other people's feelings. But if time is all you've got on this planet, then it does make great sense to be increasingly more particular about who you spend time with. And granted, we're all often in a situation where it's still good for us to meet new people, and we don't know who those people, that top core people might necessarily be 3 years from now. So we need to still get out there. I understand that. I'm in the same boat. But nonetheless, it's a different way of thinking. Other things that he talks about that are helpful, self-discipline. So one of the lies he talks about is just that, if only we were all more disciplined, we'd get more done. And he basically explains the research that all of us only have a certain amount of self-discipline. And it's rather like the battery life on our mobile phones, that as the day wears on, the battery starts to run down. And so really, in many ways, he says that the morning is the best time to do the things that require the most self-discipline. It's also a good awareness check, I suppose, that it doesn't work to go all out for 12 hours and not take a break. It also explains why towards the end of the day, often we might feel frustrated or burned out because we've given so much that we've got nothing left to give. And also from a self-discipline standpoint, that we may end up then making poor decisions in how we spend our time, or maybe we start eating junk food because we simply can't make any more decisions. And this relates very much to this idea of time blocking 4 hours where you can be effective and focused. What is that best time for you? And also, what is that best location for you? So, one of the things that is important is how do you shut down those interruptions so that you can be focused and effective? Too many of us think that it's rather fun and we can be really good multitasking and doing a little bit of this and answering the phone and then checking email quickly or whatever it might be. And again, in recent years, there have been several books that have really, in the English expression, we put the boot in to this notion that multitasking is somehow remotely good or that anyone's any good at it. So these all do very much relate, though, to focusing on what your one thing is. And again, that question, what's the one thing you can do, such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary. And then the last few points that Gary Keller talks about that I want to share today are that one of the biggest obstacles you will run into is your inability to say no. And that more and more it's important to say no to things because they will get in the way of you focusing on your one thing. And that the world at large does not care what your one thing is because they want to talk to you right now, they want you to respond to their email right now, and so on and so forth. And that's where the self-discipline piece also comes in terms of being able to say no. And also, I have another client who's done an increasingly good job of communicating to his partners that he works with not to interrupt him during certain times so that he can do what he does best and focus on that. And I'm aware that what I just said sounds very much like that one thing time is to do what you do best and what you love to do. And I suppose on many levels it is. I suppose part of what I'm saying is that right now, your shorter term one thing may not be that. It may be to work on different things that create that environment so that you can get there. And I think that's also really important to have some peace of mind about, that you are training or hiring somebody new so that you can delegate certain things out, so that you can spend more time focusing on your one thing, and to have that peace of mind that right now, over the next 6 months, my one thing isn't my unique ability, but it's to put a structure in place so that I can spend more time doing what I love to do and do best. And that's very important to understand, so that you don't get too frustrated that you are spinning your wheels. So I suppose those are sort of the last points really that Keller makes in his book that I want to share today, is that somehow you need to be okay, or build a resilience to this notion of chaos, that there will be still emails to answer and other people that have needs, but that you really need to build almost an insensitivity to that, because otherwise, the problem is this isn't about being a nasty person. Otherwise, you won't be able to accomplish your big dream, because you're not going to put enough time into it, because you're going to be spending too much time people pleasing and catering to other people's wishes, and that will not get you where you want to go. So very important to keep that in mind. The workout that's associated with this meeting would be to answer the question for, thinking to the end of 2017, so 2.5 years from now, what's the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? What would that one thing be to have achieved 2.5 years from now? And clearly you need more than a few seconds to think about this. And then the follow-up question would be, by the end of this year, therefore, what is the one thing that you need to have accomplished? And all you can do right now, really, I think, is schedule that time in your planner, in your diary, to think this through. Give yourself drive time, but really put yourself in the best environment where you can think this through, whether it's a coffee shop, a library, somewhere where you can be uninterrupted to really think on this. Because the problem is otherwise, the last thing you really want to do is to get back and immediately get on the phone and start getting busy again, when all you have in your life is time. And it's crucial, therefore, that you think about, how do I most need to be spending that time, and not just get busy again with other things that will ultimately, it's that definition of insanity, that will have you continuing to do the same things you've always done. And that's what's inspiring about the Keller book, and that's why it's so important to revisit this topic consistently. And I will present this topic regularly, because I think it's important, and we all need to keep focused on making sure we're doing that. So that would be my recommendation in terms of what you do next. And in terms of future gym sessions, there are 5 sessions every week as an Open Gym member that you can join in on. And you can always watch the recordings afterwards. And other than that, there are some great upcoming events that I urge you to check out in the agenda or on my website or a newsletter. And otherwise, if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Best of luck developing your one thing, and look forward to joining you on another session.